All right, Shavuot say good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Selma Wolf, for dedicating all the Sherman Joshos this month with immense gratitude for the refuahs from Hashem in the merit of our refuah for all of those in need, and the schus of our brave soldiers in the return of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsors, Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter, in memory of Asher Buchwalter, Sayyid and Simehakin, in memory of Taji Bat Hari Bas Harav Meir Moshe, Sayyid's mother. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in the Kamma. And of course, we dedicate Maseches Bava Kamma Le'ilui Nishmas, Master Sergeant Yomi Charush. Hashem Yikom Damomi HaKadosh Baruch Hu provide his neshama with an aliyah and his family with a nechama. Also with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Ayin Ches 78, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Zayin and Beis 77b, and we are picking up 6 lines up from the bottom. Kilayim. So we'll say, remember again, in yesterday's daf, we had a lot going on in yesterday's daf. Actually, Baruch Hashem, a very exciting and packed daf. We're going to have a lot going on today in Meretz Hashem as well. A lot going on today. So one of the interesting things that was brought up was that if somebody stole an animal that's kilayim. Kilayim means a crossbred animal. One steals a crossbred animal, then goes ahead and slaughters it or sells it. The halacha is that one is chayiv dalid v'hei. So the Gemara says, really? So kilayim, you're chayiv dalid v'hei? So the Gemara says, seksiv. The pasuk says, when talking about the obligation of dalid v'hei, says a sheep. And generally, whenever we see Rava says that whenever we see the word se is always to exclude kilayim. Always to exclude kilayim. Says the Gemara, shiny hachal is different over here. Why? Damakra o lerabos. I will say over here it says shar o se. So o, ultimately again, that word o comes to include kilayim as well. The Gemara says v'chol o lerabos. So is that true? So that means every single time that ultimately you see the word o, always comes to include. So the Gemara says, but what about the fact that Tanya we learn shar o kasev? So we'll say the pasuk over is actually talking about if you have an ox or you have a sheep or a goat, if it will be born. So for 7 days it remains with its mother, and then from the 8th day and on it can be offered up as a karban. So the Gemara says, the chol ol rabos vatanya shar o kasev prat kilayim, right? So ultimately, again, the o over here comes to exclude kilayim, that you can't offer up a crossbred animal as a karban. So the Gemara says o's. When it says o's, o comes to exclude prat l'nidme. We'll say nidme means an animal that's born with some type of mutation. You can't go and offer it up as a karban. Amar Rava, so the point over here is you see from here that in these psukim, O is coming to exclude something, not coming to include something. Yet over here, by our pasuk and Dalet and Hey, you're coming to use O to include. So what's going on? Amar Rava, hacha mein yana dikra v'hacha mein yana dikra. So Rava said this is interesting. Apparently the Gemara explains that the word O could sometimes be used to include, and the word O could sometimes be used to exclude. Everything depends on the context of the pasuk. Incredible. So the Gemara listen to this. Sahacha gabi gneva dichsiv. When it comes in our pasuk of theft of dalad vehei, where the pasuk says shar ose shiata yachal lahotzi kilayim minehem. All the rabbos comes. Well, this is interesting. So a shar and a seh, you can't create a crossbred animal from an ox and a sheep. They cannot reproduce together. So we'll say, so because of that, the word O must be coming to include a crossbred animal. Gabe kachim dichsiv kesev ve'ez, but ultimately again by karbanos, where it says ultimately again a sheep and a goat. Shati yotzi lohotzi kilayim minehem. You can't crossbreed between those two types of animals. So therefore, O lemait. O must come to exclude a crossbred animal. O lemaitu. 78. So says, interestingly enough, just in the wild world of crossbreeding, what we begin to see is that by karbanos you cannot use a crossbred animal, but yet in the laws of theft, dalid vehei, there will be liability for a crossbred animal. In other words, if you steal and then slaughter a crossbred animal, there will be a chiyuv of dalid vehei. Incredible. Tab of Einches. Ay v'ha gabe kodshim nami ne'emar shar. O kasev, shenat hayachal lahotzi kilai me'meneim, v'nirbi. So we'll say, so now the Gemara says, well, 1 second. So now, if you're telling me every single time the Torah states 2 animals, and those 2 animals cannot reproduce together, and you find the word O must be coming to include ultimately again a crossbred animal. In fact, if that's the case by karbanos, right? The Torah says shar o kasev, an ox or a sheep, right? Remember, an ox and a sheep cannot reproduce together. It says O, so why don't we use that to mean that O teaches me that by karbanos you can offer up a crossbred animal? To which the Gemara says, no. No. In that case, since the end of the pasuk, there's another O. There's another O. Since the O at the end of the pasuk comes to exclude a crossbred animal, certainly the O at the beginning of the pasuk comes to exclude as well. The Gemara says, I don't stand adarabba. I can see just the opposite. Why don't they say, since the O in the beginning of the pasuk comes to include a crossbred animal, maybe the O at the end of the pasuk comes to include as well? To which the Gemara says, no. Hi, mai. So let's analyze this. So I'll say, if you understand that by karbanos the O is coming to exclude crossbred animals, then I understand why I would need 2 exclusions. Why? Da'afagav de'imit kilayim itzdirich lemeute nidme. So I'll say it's fascinating. Because one O is coming to exclude crossbred animal, kilayim. The other O is coming to exclude nidme. I will say nidme means a mutated animal, like we saw before. But if you say that the O in Kodshim is coming to include something, then why do I need 2 inclusionary words? So I'll say if it's coming to include, then hashta kilayim irbile nid memibai. We'll say if you include that a crossbred animal could be offered up, then certainly what? A mutated animal could be offered up. So it's an interesting idea, actually. The idea is that a crossbred animal, which is a different species, if that could be offered up as a carbon, then certainly a mutated animal. A mutated animal is the same species, just whatever, something occurred. So once you already told me that a crossbred animal could be offered up, it goes without saying that a mutated animal could be offered up as well. Ella. So I'll say, so therefore again, it must be that by karbanos, both of those O's come to exclude. Okay, one to exclude ultimately again a crossbred animal, one to exclude a mutated animal. So therefore I will say, what we end up having over here is that ultimately again, by karbanos, ultimately we're excluding a mutated animal, or I should say we're excluding a crossbred animal and a mutated animal, but by the halachos of gneva, by the halachos of theft, even a crossbred animal is included. So if you were to steal and then slaughter a crossbred animal, halacha l'maisi, you would be chayiv daled vehei arba v'chamisha. Okay, so we'll say, so now we come full circle. Ela hada amarava ze banaav. Remember how this whole thing started. Rava espoused the principle, and Rava said that whenever the Torah uses the word seh, right, seh is there to go ahead and create a binyan, a paradigm. What's the paradigm? Seh and not crossbreeding. Right, that's seh, a purebred animal and not a crossbred animal. So we'll say, so now the problem is Rava said this rule, but it doesn't sound like the real rule is really true. It sounds like the rule is really based on the presence of the word O, number 1, and number 2, which types of animals are mentioned in the pasuk itself. So if that's the case, what does the rule of Rava, what does the paradigm of Rava really come to include? Se'ila kachim, behedjik siv, shar o kesef prat lekilayim. So I'll say, if it's by karbanos, so we just got finished by karbanos. Karbanos, again, the pasuk says, shar o kesef, the O comes to exclude a crossbred animal. Ila meiser, so maybe you're going to tell me it's from meiser. So the Gemara says, tachas yalif mikachim. We have a gzera shava of tachas from meiser to kachim. Just like by kachim, ultimately, again, you can't bring a crossbred animal. So too for meiser, you can't designate a crossbred animal. Okay, ila bachar. So I'll say maybe it's bachar. by telling me that a crossbred animal is not subject to the din of Bachar. Sa'avara ha'avara yalif mi-meiser. Again, I have Gzeira Shava, ultimately of Bachar to Meiser to Kachim, and therefore in all of these cases, a crossbred animal is exempt. Inami nidme amritlo. The other possibilities, maybe you'll say it'll come to exclude a mutated animal. D'chsiv ach Bachar shar. So we'll say, but there the pasuk says, Ach b'char shar. At shehu shar u'b'choro shar. Ultimately, again, only, we'll see, when is there a din b'char? Only when the father or the parent is a shar, and ultimately, again, the b'char is a shar. In other words, that there can't be any mutations. So, kilayim ibai, a crossbred. So I will say, if you're excluding, remember, if you're excluding a mutation, then it goes without saying that you are excluding a crossbred animal. Ella ki itmar de Rava. So I'll say we're just trying to figure out. Again, Rava espoused this rule. What was his rule? Wherever the Torah uses the word seh, ultimately, again, it's coming to exclude a crossbred animal. The problem just is, to be honest, it doesn't really seem like we need the rule. In other words, we're learning it out from a whole bunch of different places. So obviously, Rava must be referring to something specific. What is he referring to? So the Gemara says, Ella ki itmar de Rava le'inyan peter chamar. Very interesting. Rather, what was Rava referring to? Rava was referring to the redemption of a firstborn donkey. Kidisnan, here we go. Ain podin. Supposed to remember again, the pidyon concept, pidyon peter chamar, is actually very interesting, because normally, and we have the din ultimately of bachar animal. Right? So bachar has sanctity. You have to give it to the kohen. The one exception to this kosher animal bachar rule is chamar. A firstborn donkey is endowed with sanctity. Isn't that with sanctity? So what's the halacha? Either you have to redeem it or break its neck. Break its neck. So now, obviously, what are you redeeming? What are you redeeming the peter chamar with? You're redeeming it with another kosher, with a kosher animal. So watch this. Here we go. The Gemara says, "Kidisnan, in podin lo be'egel, v'lo bechaya, v'lo b'shchuta, v'lo b'treifa, v'lo b'kilayim, v'lo b'koi." So ultimately, again, So the halacha is that you can't redeem a firstborn chamar not with. First of all, before we go on, look at Rashi. Linyan pidyon peter chamar tichsiv seh. Both say the Torah uses the word seh when it comes to redemption of peter chamar. V'kashmeina rava taima demaslisin diktani ein podim b'kilayim mehachahu. So therefore the Mishnah says you can't go ahead and redeem your firstborn donkey with an egel, a calf, not with a chayin, non-domesticated animal, not b'shchuta, not with a shechted animal, lo b'treifa or treifa animal, for lo b'kilayim. Now with both say now with a kai. Remember we had kai. Remember again we had kai a lot at the end of our last cycle in Maseches Chulin. So there's a lot of discussion about kai. Kai is an animal that Chazal weren't sure, is it a behema or is it a chaya? Right? Is it a domestic animal, non-domesticated animal? Again, the major nafkamina for that is kisoy hadam. Right? You have to cover the blood after slaughter. For behema, you don't have to do that. For chaya, you do have to do that. So again, you can't redeem. You can't redeem peter chamar with any of these things. Now, for our purposes, why does this matter? Because again, this is what Rava was talking about. Why can't you redeem a firstborn donkey with a seh? Ultimately, why can't you redeem a firstborn donkey ultimately again with kilayim, with a crossbred animal? Because Torah says seh. And whenever the Torah says seh comes to exclude a crossbred animal. Okay, beautiful. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar, the mater b'kilayim. This is not Rabbi Lazar mater b'kilayim. B'pnei shehu seh l'may hilchasa. I said, Rabbi Lazar says that you can go ahead and redeem a firstborn donkey with a crossbred animal. Why? Because halacha l'may, Rabbi Lazar says that even a crossbred seh is still called a seh. Still called the seh. So ultimately, again, according to Rabbi Lazar, what does Rava's statement come to accomplish? Rabbi Lazar would say, Ki itmar de Rava, when ultimately again Rava made his statement, ultimately again, Litame shenolad min hatahar v'ibura min hatame. Very interesting. So I'll say when Rava made his statement disqualifying a crossbred animal, what type of crossbred animal did he disqualify? Listen to this. This is referring to a non-kosher animal born to a kosher animal that had a non-kosher father. Interesting case here. So you have a non-kosher father, a kosher mother, and the offspring is a non-kosher animal. So ultimately, again, that's the type of kilayim, that's the type of crossbreeding that ultimately, again, Rava would disqualify. One more time. Ki itmar de Rava, ultimately, again, when Rava disqualified a crossbred animal, whenever you see the word seh, litame, a non-kosher animal, shenolad min hatahar, that was born to a kosher mother, vi'ibura min hatame, but its father was not kosher. His father was not kosher. Now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi gives an interesting example over here. L'tamei shenolad min atar, para sheyalda sus va'aviv sus. It is a cow that gave birth to a horse whose father is a horse. Now, we're going to discuss this a bit more in depth in just a moment. I mean, not that much more in depth, but a little bit more in depth. Right, so the idea over here is you have a cow that gave birth to a horse whose father is a horse. Or rachel sheyalda chazir va'aviv chazir, right? Or a sheep that gave birth to a chazir and the father is a chazir. The aser ba'achila dichsiv zosa behema sher tochlu shar se ksavim. V'chevim dichsiv se prat l'kilayim ki agavna. So I'll say this is actually interesting. So this is now in Rabbi Lazar's understanding. In Rabbi Lazar's understanding of what Rava was coming to exclude, when Rava excludes kilayim, he doesn't exclude it because this is okay. So now look what we have over here. We have a machlokes in Rava, right? Up until now, we thought Rava's statement meant like this: whenever you see the word seh always means that whenever you have crossbreeding. I both say crossbreeding could even be within the same species, but you have different types within the same species, right? Let's say sheep and goat and rams, like these are all things within the same, we'll call it family, but that would also be called interbreeding, crossbreeding. So now comes along Rabbi Lazar, and Rabbi Lazar says that's not what Rava meant. When Rava forbade the use of a crossbred animal, he was talking about mamish, like real crossbreeding, like interspecies crossbreeding. So a sheep, right? So again, in this case, like Rashi says, like a cow having a baby with a horse, and the baby is a horse, that type of crossbred offspring ultimately, again, is going to be prohibited for any kind of use. So the Gemara says, so the Delok Rabbi Yoshua, and that's not like Rabbi Yoshua. Why? Because Rabbi Yoshua say. So the Gemara says, Delok Rabbi Yoshua. Di Rabbi Yoshua misek savim v'seizim nafka. So Rabbi Yoshua learns this out from sek savim seizim. Ache aviv keves v'imo kivsa. Okay, so Rabbi Yoshua learns this out from a different source. Rabbi Yoshua learns out this concept that ultimately, again, until the mother and father are of the same species. Fine. So we'll say, so now what we end off with is in machlokes. We'll say, so here's what we have up until this point that we're going to get a bit more technical. What we have up until this point is a statement of Rava, right? Yeah, it wasn't technical until now. Now we're going to get really technical, right? So we have a statement of Rava, right? Rava espoused a principle that whenever you see the word seh comes to exclude crossbreeding. So we tried to plug that concept into two areas of halacha. Number one, dalid vehei, and number two, karbanos, the type of animal that's fit for karbanos. It turned out that we don't really utilize Rava in either of those two areas because halacha l'maisa, those two areas really have their own drashas. So therefore, by theft, we know that shechayiv for theft, kefal dalid behei, by a crossbred animal. By karbanos, we learn out from an old drasha that you can't use a crossbred animal. So we're trying to figure out, so where does Rava come in? I'll tell you where Rava comes in. Rava comes in ultimately, again, by the redemption of a firstborn donkey. Torah uses the word seh, by redemption of a firstborn donkey. We learn from there that what? You cannot use a crossbred animal for a redemption of a donkey. So the Gemara says, now by the way, just in that discussion, something else came up, which was a machlokes in the statement of Rava. When Rava says you can't use a crossbred animal, the shaila is, what's the definition of crossbreeding? Is it minor crossbreeding or major crossbreeding? Rabbi Lazar says it's only major crossbreeding. Namely, again, a horse father has a baby with a cow, and the baby is a horse, right? That ultimately, again, that's where the offspring would be precluded or would be unusable based on set. Now the Gemara says, just a technical question, utahora mitmei ma'abra. So I'll say, is that possible? Is that possible? First, the Gemara just asks a general question: can a kosher animal become pregnant from a non-kosher animal? Is such a concept like that generally possible? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Torah mitmeh mima abra, the itzrich lemiute, va kamla parakam de bechoros, the olam em misaberes, lo tmeh mitar, velo Torah mitmeh. So it's just actually interesting that the Gemara actually points out that the gestational periods between kosher animals and non-kosher animals generally don't line up. So the Gemara says, this case that you gave me of a crossbred animal, according to Belazar, of like a cow conceiving from a horse, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. So how can you ever have a case? In other words, we'll say, here's what's interesting. Rabbi Lazar is coming to say that Rava's statement that whenever you see seh is coming, excuse me, to exclude kilayim. What type of kilayim is that coming to exclude? What type of kilayim? Like dramatic kilayim. Kosher animal having a baby with a non-kosher father, and therefore the offspring is not kosher. Now the Gemara says, is that actually possible? To which the Gemara says, listen to this. In the Kamma, Amud Beis. I know, you got excited about the pace that we did on Aleph. You thought we were on track. No. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Rather, the Kamma, listen to this. Di aber mikalut Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi say, this is actually very interesting. When can you have a case of a non-kosher animal, right, or a kosher animal conceiving with a non-kosher animal and having non-kosher offspring? So Rabbi said, listen to this. What happens, for argument's sake, if you have a cow without cloven hoofs? So Rabbi say a cow without cloven hoofs is considered to be a non-kosher animal, right? Even though species-wise, it is kosher, but Lamaisa, it is lacking the simonim of a non-kosher animal. So Rabbi says it's actually very interesting. So Rabbi Shimon has this concept. So for example, if you were to have a father cow with uncloven hoofs, right, conceive, and the mother is a regular cow, cloven hoofs, right, or father's an ox, mother's a cow, right, and then they have a baby, right, cow with uncloven hoofs. That would actually be a case of a non-kosher animal conceiving with a kosher animal, having offspring that's not kosher. So Rabbi says, so now we thought that the kosher, non-kosher mating model that produced non-kosher offspring was like dramatic, like cows and horses producing horses. No, okay, so we're kind of abandoning that. But halacha l'maisa, there is this other possibility of even an animal which is species-wise kosher, but doesn't have the simonim of a kosher animal, ultimately again being unkosher. Look at top Rashi. Rashi says over here, the Abra mikalut Rabbi Shimon, kalit parsosav klutos v'nola minatar, Rabbi Shimon karile tame. What's Rabbi Shimon? Now again, whether this is accepted the halacha is a different discussion, but this is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds again species-wise, if you have an animal that species-wise is kosher, but it itself does not have the simanim of a kosher animal, Rabbi Shimon says that animal is tamei. It's really fascinating. So Rabbi Shimon holds that essentially a cow without cloven hooves is essentially like a chazer. It's the same thing like a chazer. No different. He says, "Karlei tamei disayim bebechoros." Rabbi Shimon Omer gamal shnei pa'amim. So he says, "Echad gamal hanolad min agamla, ve'echad gamal hanolad min apara, va'afilu arasa min atar mishar gamar ka'asa Rabbi Shimon." Okay, so what is the position of Rabbi Shimon? So again, therefore, kind of coming full circle. So now we end off with a machlokes in Rava. When Rava says every single time it says seh comes to exclude ultimately again any type of crossbred animal. So now halacha l'maisa, machlokes has the definition of crossbreeding that Rava excluded. Either we'll call it dramatic crossbreeding, or no halacha, or that would really be the case of Rabbi Lazar, or no even less dramatic crossbreeding, but even within the same species, a crossbred animal would ultimately again be usher. We also saw the case of where, according to Rabbi Lazar, you could have the dramatic crossbreeding, kosher with non-kosher. Does it literally mean like a non-kosher species with a kosher animal? Is that gestational periods will not line up, but rather again a kosher animal lacking the simanim ultimately is considered to be a non-kosher animal. I will say, but for our purposes, just to understand, the way we paskin, kind of just coming full circle, is that halacha l'maisa, the din of dalid arba v'chamisha, dalid v'hei, kfl 4 and 5 time payment will apply even to a crossbred animal. That's how we paskin. Halacha l'maisa, on the other hand, when it comes to, let's say, karbanos, so halacha l'maisa, by karbanos, you cannot use a crossbred animal. Okay, let's go weiter. By Rava. So Rava asked as follows: Hare alai ola v'hifrish sharp. So we'll say interesting case. Interesting case. Reuven says, I hereby take upon myself an olah. Bring an olah. V'here for sure, he sets aside a cow, right, an ox, as his olah. Okay, so we'll say, so now what happened? Uba achar v'ganav, so we'll call that Shimon, right? Shimon does that. Reuven comes along and Reuven steals the animal. Okay, now Reuven stole a carbon. Right, he stole Shimon's shar that was set aside ultimately again as an olah. All right. So now what's talacha? So mi pater ganav nafshe b'keves l'rabanan ba'olah sa'of l'rabalaza ben Azariah. So we'll say, let me tell you the question outside, and then we'll focus on it because it's really very interesting. Let's say for an olah, you could use a whole range of animals. Right, a whole range of animals. So like the most intense animal you could use is a shar. You could use an ox. But at the same time, you could also exempt yourself with a bird. So we'll say, so now watch this. So now here's the case. Shimon went ahead and set aside an ox as an olah. Reuven stole his ox. So now Reuven wants to go ahead and make amends. So what's the shaila? We'll say here the shaila. The shaila is, does Reuven have to give back the ox? Or could Reuven essentially what? Give back a lesser animal that's in the same olah family. In other words, Reuven will give back an animal through which Shimon will be able to discharge his obligation. And right, discharge his obligation. I will say, I also want to point out over here, the case over here is really very interesting. What is Shimon saying? Hare alai. Hare alai. Now remember again, there are two ways in which you could go ahead and offer up a carbon. What are the two ways? Hare alai or Hare zu. What's the difference? Hare alai means the obligation is incumbent upon me. Hare zu means I'm designating this animal as the carbon. So in this case over here, Shimon is taking upon himself the obligation to bring an olah. Now, he designated this shar. Reuven stole the shar. Now Reuven wants to be a Baal Tshuva. But the shaila is, does he have to give back the shar? Now we'll say we must be talking about a situation where the shar itself is gone. Right, the shar itself is gone. Because obviously any time, remember we spoke about this before, any time the stolen item is extant, then what? You're always obligated to give back that item. So let's say again now, there's the shar that he stole is not there. So the shaila is he obligated to give back a shar? Or can he give back any animal that technically is in this olah family through which Shimon could go ahead and discharge his obligation? So for example, specifically, would he have to give back a sheep according to the Rabbanan, or ultimately again a bird according to Rabbi ben Azariah? This none, because here we learn Hare alai olah. Just stam case, I come along and I say I'm hereby obligating myself and bringing an olah. First white line yavi keves. So the Rabbanan say you have to bring a sheep. So we'll say failure to designate an animal as a particular olah locks you into a keves. Sheep. That's what you're obligated to go ahead and bring. Rabbi ben Azariah says, Yavi tar o ben Yonah. Rabbi ben Azariah says, if you didn't designate an animal, so ultimately again you're locked into is a turtle dove or a young dove. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so what do you do in this case over here? What do you do in this case over here? Where halacha l'maisa again, Reuven stole the olah from Shimon. Now he wants to, right, and it was a shar, right? Shimon had designated a shar. Now Reuven wants to be a Baal Tshuva. Does he have to give back a shar? Or could he give back any one of the other, we'll call it animals that fit into this category? So mi'amrinan shem ola kabil iluye. So odilma. So can we see? Listen, Shimon wanted to give an olah. So as long as Reuven gives back something that is within the olah spectrum, you're good to go. Odilma matziyar. The other possibility is no. Shimon could say to Reuven, so on the other hand, right, Shimon could say to Reuven, what are you talking about? You can't give me a turtle dove, right? L'maisa again, I dafka separated a shar because I wanted to do this right. I wanted to do the mitzvah min ha-muvchar. Therefore, if you want to be a Baal Tshuva, give me back a shar. So basar di bayi hader pashte. So I'll say after the question was asked, it was answered. Ganav pater atzmo bekeves l'rabanan ba'olah sa'of l'Rabbi ben Azariah. So we'll say this is actually fascinating. At the end of the day, the Gemara actually paskins that halacha l'maisa, Reuven, when he does tshuva, only has to give back the basic unit of Ola. Now, it's a machlokes what the basic unit of Ola is. According to the Rabbanon, the basic unit of Ola, the default unit, is a sheep, right? According to Rabbi ben Azariah, it's a bird. But interestingly enough, everyone is agreeing that what doesn't he have to give back? What doesn't he have to give back? The shar. Really quite interesting. Really quite interesting. So the Gemara says, Rav Acha Rav Ika Maslila Behedja. So Rav Acha Rav Isa, he stated this explicitly. Amar Rava Harei Alai Ola. Right? Ruvain said, I hereby take upon myself an Ola. V'hifrish Shar, he separated out a Shar. Sorry, Shimon said, and he separated out a Shar. Uba Achar V'ganbo. And then what happens? Ruvain came along and stole the Shar. Pater atzmo bekeves l'Rabbanan uba olas ha'of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. The thief has the ability to exempt himself, right, to satisfy his obligation, according to the Rabbanan, ultimately again with a sheep, and according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, ultimately again with a bird. It was really fascinating halacha. So even though again in general there's a concept of a heshves hagzela, so again halacha lemaisa, the logic is as follows. The logic is as follows. That essentially once Shimon designates the shar ultimately as an ola, essentially what ends up happening over here is the shar loses its identity as a shar and go ahead and assumes the identity ultimately again of an ola. That's really what's happening over here. Therefore, when Ruvain steals the shar, halacha doesn't view him as stealing a shar. What does halacha view him as? What does halacha view him as? As stealing an ola. I will say, this in general is part of the fascinating dynamic of karbanos, right? I will say the pasuk says, the pasuk talks about the idea. Sfas Emes brings down this idea. The Ger Rebbe brings down this idea. It's the most fascinating idea. He says, what is the most incredible, like, earth-shattering yediyah concept that comes out of karbanos is that ultimately, again, you could take an animal which is like the basest of the base, right? The basis of the base. And what happens? You suddenly say, Harezu Ola, it's an Ola, then suddenly what happens? So this animal is transformed into a chefza of Kedusha. It's transformed suddenly into an item of holiness, right? Parenthetically, the Sfas Emes says, what do you see from here? If an animal could be transformed with a mere declaration, then I will say what you see is the power of a declaration to be something greater. Sfas Emes says that often we think that the only pathway to greatness is through dynamic activity. He says it's not true. Even when a person articulates a vision of who they want to be, of what they want to be, right? I make a mission statement for my life. This is the person I want to become. That statement itself is transformative even before you actually did anything, right? It transforms you. V'haraya, if by saying to that animal, shar, you're an ola, so suddenly again, boom, it's kodesh. It's kodesh. You see that a declaration of holiness, an aspirational statement of holiness, by definition transforms who and what you are. If it works for animals, alachas kamma v'kamma. We see this all the time. I would say, when you tell yourself who you want to be and what you want to be, and you declare, I want to be someone greater, you feel different about yourself. You just feel different. You didn't do anything. I didn't do anything yet. It doesn't make a difference. A declarative statement that ultimately, again, outlines who I want to be, what I want to accomplish, fundamentally changes me in life. If it works for the shar, ultimately, again, then it works for the adam as well. Incredible yisod. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, when Ruvain steals the shar, when Ruvain steals the animal, ultimately again from Shimon, halacha doesn't view him as stealing a shar. Halacha views him as stealing an ola. Stealing an ola. So as such, what does he have to give back? An ola, right? So now what's the definition of ola? So that's the machlokes. According to the Rabbanan, the default definition of an ola is going to be a keves, is going to be ultimately again a sheep. According to Elazar ben Azariah, it's going to be a turtle dove. That's what he has to give back. But he stole an ola and he has to give back an ola. Really fascinating. Okay, let's go back to Mishnah. Machro chutz me'echad mimeya shebo o shahaiselo bo shutfa. So we'll say now new topic. Listen to this case. I mean, not still Dalet Vehei, but an interesting nuance over here. Let's say same case. Ruvain stole a sheep from Shimon, and he sells the sheep. but he ends up retaining some level of ownership over the sheep. So for example, he sells it, but he retains a 1/100th ownership interest. The percentage is irrelevant. The point over here is, the point the Mishnah is making is even a very small ownership interest. See, he retains some ownership interest in the animal, right? Or for example, he had a partnership. So this is actually talking about over here. We'll see exactly the parameters of this case. He owned it in partnership, and therefore when he sold it, he only sold his chelek, right? Or hashochet. So we'll say, we're going to see in both of these cases, there is no dalet vehei. There's no dalet vehei. Now the reason we're going to see there's no dalet vehei is because dalet vehei only occurs when there is a complete sale. So in these cases, there's an incomplete sale, therefore no dalet vehei. Next, hashochev v'nesnavla biyado. Both say Reuven steals an animal, he shechts it, and when he shechts it, ultimately again it becomes an avela. So right, he botches the shechita, and ultimately the animal becomes an avela. Or nocher, or both say instead of shechting it, he stabs the animal, kills it like that. Or ma'aker. Ma'aker both say means sometimes if the knife, shochtim before they slaughter, they have to test the knife, right? The halach is you run it against your nail, right, to test the sharpness of the knife. That goal over here is to see that there are no nicks in the knife. If there's a nick in the knife, what ends up happening is, instead of cutting the simanim, the windpipe and the esophagus, you pull them. You pull them, and as a result, ultimately, again, you tear them, you uproot them. So that's called ma'aker. In all of these cases, mishayim tashlumi keifel, ve'eno mishayim tashlumi arba v'chamisha. But in all of these cases, because you had an inappropriate shechita, right? The shechita wasn't the valid shechita, wasn't the shechita. I just want to point out what's happening over here. We saw Rabbi Shimon, right? What did Rabbi Shimon say? Rabbi Shimon said, any shechita, kol shechita she'ena ru'uya, lo shma shechita. That's not this. Rabbi Shimon said, in order for you to be chayiv dalet vehei, the shechita has to produce an animal that is edible, a consumable animal. That's not necessarily this. This Mishnah is saying that in order to be chayiv dalet vehei for shechita, you have to what? You have to do an actual act of slaughter. Whether the animal is consumable afterwards is a different discussion. But this act of slaughter has to be a bona fide act of shechita. So if you don't do an act of shechita, right? You hit the animal over the head. You stab it. You go ahead and you end up, tearing the windpipe and the esophagus. That's not a shechita. It's not a shechita, and therefore Allah should be chayiv kefel, but you're not chayiv dalet vehei. Okay, so we'll say let's analyze. There's a lot to talk about over here. The Gemara says, so my chutz mi'acham. So let's talk about the first case. First case over here is Reuven stole from Shimon the animal, then he sold it. But when he sold it, ultimately again he excluded 1/100th of the animal from the sale. He retained some level of ownership. So what's the halacha? What's the halacha in that case? So the Mishnah said ultimately again he's pater from dalet vehei. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? He excluded 1/100th. What does that mean? My chutz mi'acham. Amarav chutz midavar hanitar imo b'shchita. So we'll say Rav says he excluded some part of the animal, ultimately again that would normally be included with the shchita. So in other words, so we'll say, essentially, let me tell you what's happening over here before we get into this. What the Gemara is going to say is, the only time that an exclusion from the sale kind of prevents you from being chayiv dalet vehei is when you excluded something significant. The shaila is going to be, what's the shaila? What's the definition of significant? So the Gemara says, so Rav says, it means you excluded a part of the animal that would normally be permitted through shechita. So we'll say, so for example, you excluded the leg. But for example, according to Rav, we're going to see, what if you excluded the shearings? Or you excluded the horn, right? These are not part of the animal that's permitted to you through shechita. That wouldn't be a shear, right? That wouldn't be a withholding. This would be chayiv dalet vehei. Levi says, chutz migizosel. Levi says, you excluded the shearings. Okay, we're going to explain all of this. Also, we learned this also in the Mishnah. To back up Levi, that if you excluded the shearings, this is considered to be a withholding of some significant piece, and therefore, again, it's not really considered to be a complete halachic sale, because it's not considered to be a complete halachic sale. Therefore, you're not chayiv dalet vehei. So let's analyze. Machra chutz miyada chutz miragla chutz mikarna chutz migizo seha. So we'll say, now watch this. Reuven stole a sheep from Shimon, and then he sold it to Levi. But he withheld, right? He said, I'm going to sell it to you except for the foreleg, or except for the hind leg, or except for the horn, or except for the shearings. So Rabbi say, Eino. So now I want to point out, Rabbi, does the sale work? Does the sale work? The sale works, right? Because you could sell something, you could exclude something, but what it does do is it's not considered to be a sale for Daled Vehei. In other words, in order for the thief to be Chayiv Daled Vehei, it has to be a complete sale. If you're withholding something quote unquote significant, that's not a complete sale to obligate you in Daled Vehei. So in all of these cases, the Brisa says, so if Reuven stole the sheep from Shimon and then he sells it to Levi, but he excludes from the sale with Levi, I'm holding on to the foreleg, the hind leg, the horn, the shearings. So in that case, Reuven won't pay Daled Vehei. Rabbi Yomi Rabbi says, Davar ha'ma'akiv b'shchita, eino m'shalim tashlumi arba v'chamisha, v'she'eino ma'akiv b'shchita, m'shalim arba v'chamisha. Shabbos is very interesting. So ultimately, again, so Rebbe says, is actually interesting. Rebbe says, essentially, any part of the animal that would invalidate the shchita, if you withhold it, ultimately, again, the sale doesn't generate Daled Vehei. Again, I want to point out something. We're talking about over here what type of sale generates the obligation for 4 and 5 time penalty payment. A sale, in other words, you could structure an actual, like just from like a choshen mishpat, like a mekach or memkar, just monetary law, you could structure a sale however you want it, right? You want to sell an animal and you want to exclude the foreleg, the hind leg, you, as long as both parties agree, you could do whatever you want. We're talking about over here that the Torah tells me that if Reuven steals an animal and then sells it, Reuven is chayiv Daled Vehei. So what the Gemara is trying to highlight over here is what kind of sale generates that liability. So essentially the answer is a quote-unquote complete sale. Thank you. Now I need to know what's the definition of a complete sale, or by extension, what's the definition of an incomplete sale? So now, for example, Rebbe says it's very simple. Withholding any part of the animal that would invalidate the shechita, by definition, is considered to be an incomplete sale. Right? By extension, withholding any part of the animal that would not invalidate the shechita is considered to be a complete sale, and therefore ultimately, again, would obligate you in Daled Vehei. Okay, so for example, I will say, just to give Rashi gives an extreme example. Rashi says, "Hamakim b'shchita, davar shem nital imeno nasis bonavela mechayim kigon veshet okana orev chalas." Well, I'll give you an example. Let's say again, Reuven steals the animal from Shimon, and he goes and he sells it to Levi. And he says to Levi, "I'm selling you this animal, but I'm keeping the esophagus." So obviously the esophagus is a crucial part to the shechita, right? So that would be an example of a withholding. Ultimately, again, that would prevent Reuven from being chayiv Daled Vehei. Incredible. Rabbi Shmuel Silber says chutz mikarna. Very interesting. Chutz mikarna, eino m'shalim tashlumi arba v'chamisha. Chutz migizosem m'shalim tashlumi arba v'chamisha. So Rabbi Shmuel says, if Reuven steals the animal from Shimon and then he sells it, if he excludes the horn, listen to this. If he excludes the horn, ultimately again he does not pay for arba v'chamisha. If he excludes the shearings, he does pay arba v'chamisha. Very interesting. So we'll say, let's analyze all of this. Now we have a lot of opinions over here. So Bishlama Levi Kitana Kamma. So Levi holds, so let's remember again Levi, who again originally said, if you exclude the shearings, that's an example of something that would prevent you from being obligated in Daled Vehei. So Levi holds like Tanakama, El Rav Kiman. But who does Rav hold like? So the Gemara says, Amri Rav Damar Kiai Tana. Rav holds like the following Tana. This Sanya we learned, Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, Machra chutz miyada, v'chutz miragla, eino m'shalim tashlumi arba v'chamisha. This Rabbi say. So Shimon Elazar says, Reuven steals the animal from Shimon, and what happens? He goes in and he sells it, but he excludes the foreleg, or he excludes the hind leg. So what's the halacha? He doesn't have to pay Daled Vehei. Okay, chutz mi karna, chutz mi gizosel, mishalim tashluma arba v'chamisha. Rabbi say, but if he sells the animal and he says, you know what, I'm selling it to you, but I'm withholding the horn or I'm withholding the shearings, ultimately again he does pay arba v'chamisha. So Makamifli, what's going on over here? So Tanakama Savar, here we go. Tanakama holds utivacho kula ba'inan umacharo kula ba'inan. So Tanakama holds like this. Tanakama holds like this. Just like when it comes to shechita, ultimately again I will say, you shech the whole animal or you shech none of it. Right? Shechita is an all or nothing proposition. So either you shech the whole thing or you don't. So too, for mechira, in order to be chai for mechira, what has to happen? Either you sell everything or you don't sell everything. And if you don't sell everything, then ultimately, again, we'll say, just to be clear, then the sale might be a valid sale, but you're not chayiv arba v'chamisha. You're only chayiv, Tanakh you're only chayiv arba v'chamisha if it's an all-in sale. Comparing again, tvicha, mechira to tvicha. For Rabbi Sava, Rabbi says, utavacho. Rabbi says when the pasuk says if you shechted, midi dahavi b'tvicha, lafuke midi dahavi b'tvicha. So we'll say Rabbi says like this. Rabbi says utvacho teaches me like this. Rabbi say when it comes to shechita, not every part of the animal matters when it comes to shechita. So just like there are parts of the animal that don't matter when it comes to shechita, so too there are going to be parts of the animal that don't matter when it comes to mechira. When it comes to mechira, so we'll say, what's a good example of that? A good example of that will be the shearings, will be the horn, right? There are parts of the animal, even parts of the limbs of the animal, that ultimately, again, if you didn't have them, right, or they're removed by shechita, it just doesn't matter. So we'll say, here's what's interesting is, both Rebbe and the Tanakhama are understanding that you equate the sale with shechita. It's just a shayla of how they're equating it. So, right? And so in the Tanakhama's model, Tanakhama is saying just like shechita is on the whole animal, so to you only chayiv daled v'hei if you sell the entire animal. Rebbe says, just like by shechita, there are only parts, right? There are parts of the animal that really don't come into play by shechita. So too, again, those same parts wouldn't come into play by the sale as well. Incredible. Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, Karna delo lemigza kaima havishir. So as Rabbi Shimon Elazar will say like this. A horn, or havishir, sorry. The horn, which is not normally something that is set aside to be removed, ultimately, again, if you remove it, right, if you sell the animal and you withhold the horn for yourself, that is considered to be something lacking in the sale, and therefore, ve'enu tashlum arba v'chamisha. Gizosel, on the other hand, shearings, dilemegas kaimi, lo havi shir u'mishalim tashlum arba v'chamisha. So Rabbi Shmuel has an interesting point. He says when it comes to the sale, what we look at is things that are normally removed from the animal versus things that are not normally removed from the animal. So horns aren't normally removed. Shearings are normally removed. So therefore, again, if a person, right, if Reuven the thief sells the animal and he withholds the horn, that's considered to be a lacking in the sale, and therefore you're not chayiv daled v'hei. Shearings, where halacha l'maaseh it's normal to be removed. So if Reuven the thief sells the sheep and withholds the shearings for himself, then halacha l'maaseh that's not considered to be something lacking in the sale. Incredible. The idach Tana, the Shimon Elazar. The other opinion according to Shimon Elazar, what does he hold? Savar Yadav Veragdav Detzrichi Tvicha Havishir. So he hold like this: the hind legs and the forelegs, which only become permitted if shchita. So therefore, if you withhold them, you retain ownership over them in a sale. Ultimately, again, that's a lacking in the sale. Therefore, you're not chayiv arba v'chamisha. Karne v'gizo said, on the other hand, the horns and the shearings, which ultimately, again, do not require shchita, lo havishir, ultimately is not considered to be something lacking in the sale. Okay, so the Gemara says, Kasha Rabbi Shimon Elazar. I both we seem to have a machlokes Rabbi Shimon Elazar, two different opinions attributed to him. Not a problem. Trei Tanoi Va'alivi Rabbi Shimon Elazar. Both say ultimately again there are two different opinions, two different Tanoim in accordance with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So both say what we come out with over here is something really interesting. Bottom line is, The drasha, interestingly enough, are similar. Because remember, the Torah equates the sale to the slaughter. So the shaila is, how do you make that comparison? Do you say that just like slaughter is all in, so too the sale must be all in, and you can't exclude anything, or no? Just like the slaughter is only necessary for parts of the animal, so too as long as the sale includes certain critical parts, even if you retain certain parts for yourself, that doesn't matter. So that's the machlokes. Let's go a little bit weiter, another minute. So Tanra Rabbanan, Hagonev, Hakitaas, Vesachi Geres, Vesasuma. So we'll say ultimately again, if halacha lemaisa, so a person goes ahead and steals an amputated animal, a crippled animal, a blind animal, Vechina Gonev Behemas Ashutfin. So we'll say somebody goes ahead and steals an animal that belongs to partners. Chayiv. And we'll say actually what we'll do is we're going to stop over here for today by the Tanna Rabbanan. We'll say just again, so we're leaving off. We don't know. Here's what we know is it appears that everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa, there is a case where if you sell the animal but retain something for yourself, the thief retains something for himself, that will be a problem in the sale, and ultimately again, when we say problem in the sale, is the sale might be a valid sale, but l'maisa, the ganav will not be chayiv dalid vehei. The shaila is, what level of animal retention is considered to be significant enough so as to preclude the person from being chayiv in dalid vehei? We'll say, I'll just say, it's such a chizik, right? Coming to shul in a morning like this, where already again the world is beginning to shut down, everything is beginning to shut down because of a couple of snowflakes, which is ridiculous, right? Okay, different discussion, right? But the answer will say, this is the power of Daf Yomi and the power of our commitment. The power of our commitment, I will say, that the truth is, it's independent of the weather, it's independent of whatever else is happening in life. This is what it means to be committed to something, I will say. The same way that no one ever says to their spouse, you know what, there's a lot of snow today, I'm off, right? You know, again, you know what, I think today I'm going to be a lousy husband, right? Or I'm not going to fulfill my responsibilities because of inclement weather, right? Due to inclement weather, I'm going to mistreat my spouse, right? No, there's no such thing. There are certain things that you are committed to independent of any external realities. And I will say it is absolutely beautiful for us to show that Torah is one of those things. Torah is one of those things that no matter what is happening in the world, no matter what is happening in my life, I remain 100% fully vested and committed. However, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should see the heightened level of our commitment should be a schus for ourselves, it should be a schus for our families, and it should be a schus for Besoros Tovos for Klal Yisrael. We'll say Shkoyach, good Shabbos.